All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read High Risers by Ben Austen. We are on the middle of page 240. J.R. Fleming. When J.R. was arrested for selling drugs on the far north side, it was Jesse White who picked up the phone, telling the prosecutor that he vouched for the young man. Quote, Jesse White took me under his wing, end quote, J.R. said. As part of the Young Democrats of Cook County, J.R. helped out whenever the ward boss, George Dunn, hosted a community event or when White needed guys to pass out turkeys or school supplies. In the procession at the annual Bud Billiken Parade across the South Side, he carried the banner of the ward organization. And come election time, he hung campaign posters, tore down those of the opposition, and ushered Cabrini residents to the polls. Quote, I was being raised politically, end quote, J.R. explained. One time, the pastor at Holy Family asked J.R. if he could get his bosses to fix the sidewalks in front of the church. He brought it up, and the sidewalk was repaved. Quote, it was an awakening, end quote, J.R. recalled. Quote, politics is a means to an end. My power got that done. It felt great, end quote. Men ran the ward. Women, for the most part, ran Cabrini Green. Marion Stamps cornered J.R. one day at a neighborhood youth center. Quote, don't be a puppet's puppet, end quote, she warned him. Quote, there's always a master pulling both of your strings, end quote. She ran again for alderman in 1995, reminding voters that she orchestrated the gang truce and railing against the plans to tear down the sections of Cabrini Green. She called it a tragedy that, quote, revitalization, end quote, meant moving in white and wealthier residents and moving out the neighborhood's longtime inhabitants. Quote, it's no accident that they pieced together this ward with little pockets of black people that they intend to make disappear. It's all about displacement and reclaiming the land, end quote, she said. Quote, if they come at Cabrini in the daytime, they're going to come after the rest of them at night. And that's not only public housing, that's any housing that's available for poor people, end quote. Her chief opponent in the race was J.R.'s immediate supervisor in the ward office, the chairman of the Young Democrats. Walter Burnett, who was a young man in the Cabrini row houses, was an accomplice in a bank robbery and served some jail time. After his release, Burnett went to work for the ward organization and was mentored by Jesse White before rising through the local patronage system. He had the power brokers on his side. J.R. was one soldier in a small army of campaign workers they commanded. Burnett won easily, and Stamps decided to leave the Cabrini Green area and move back to her hometown of Jackson, Mississippi. Her father was still living there, and she saw a fitting symmetry in attaining political office where her activism began. But at the age of 51, before she packed a single bag, Stamps died of a heart attack in her sleep. Quote, stress killed her, end quote, her daughter Gwana said. About a year after Burnett's election, J.R. decided to get out of politics altogether. He had worked what he called slave hours for 6 straight days, setting up for the 1996 Democratic National Convention. By pulling off the event without a hitch, the second Mayor Daley would simultaneously match his father as political kingmaker, helping launch Bill Clinton's re-election campaign, and surpass him by avoiding the chaos that ensued on the streets in the convention hall a generation before. "28 years earlier, when Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff used his nominating speech to denounce the, quote, Gestapo tactics, end quote, of the Chicago police, then beating up protesters on Michigan Avenue, people observing the first Mayor Daley said he yelled, quote, fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch. You lousy motherfucker. Go home, end quote. Daley Sr. said he never in his life used such language. Quote, faker, end quote, was what his supporters said he shouted. In 1968, Chicago had used tall fencing to mask the bleakness of the old Stockyard neighborhood surrounding the convention center. Sorry about that. The 1996 convention took place in the United Center, the new home of the Bulls and Blackhawks, completed just west of the Loop 2 years earlier at a cost of $175 million. Daley's vision for the city was inspired by his trips to Paris, Chicago as a post-industrial urban gem, a global city, and a central tourist attraction. Here was an opportunity to showcase the revitalized Chicago he was creating, a city once again on the make. Several of the Horner high-rises across from the United Center were demolished. The city covered nearby vacant lots with wood chips and newly planted bushes. Owners of parking lots and other properties in the vicinity were pressured to put up wrought iron fencing and planter boxes. Roads were repaved and lined with antique-style street lamps and hanging flower baskets. Bridges were painted, the exteriors of nearby schools restored, street signs added, and the train running west from the Loop over Lake Street reopened. And like in Paris, the office buildings in the Loop were lit up at night. When Bill Clinton first ran for president, he presented himself as a, quote, new Democrat, end quote. He derided the longtime failures of government and pledged to, quote, end welfare as we know it, end quote, explaining that William Julius Wilson's writing on, quote, concentration effects, end quote, made me see the problems of race and poverty in the inner city in a different light, end quote. Running again as a moderate in 1996, angling to win back congressional seats lost 2 years earlier, Clinton touted the welfare reform bill that he signed into law only a week before his arrival in Chicago. The federal entitlement now came with work requirements and a lifetime limit of 5 years for any recipient. He sold himself as tough on crime as well. He was putting 100,000 new police officers on the streets and had made, quote, 3 strikes and you're out, end quote. Lifetime sentences for habitual offenders, the law of the land. The Republican presidential candidate, Bob Dole, refers to public housing on the campaign trail as, quote, one of the last bastions of socialism in the world, end quote, arguing for its privatization and erasure. Clinton agreed that the program needed to be curtailed, accepting that the demand-side marketplace probably couldn't do worse than the likes of the CHA. Jesse Jackson spoke at the convention, reluctantly, he claimed, saying that Clinton's cuts to the social safety net were a devastating blow to the have-nots. He said new public housing complexes were in fact being built and maintained across the land. They were the federal and state prisons that were home disproportionately to black men. Jackson argued that the Democrats still needed to be the party that fought for the social well-being of all Americans. The idea that there were enough decent-paying jobs out there for anyone with initiative to seize was a fantasy. Citing Martin Luther King Jr., he said there were, quote, mountaintops, end quote, of prosperity in the center of his city, but much of the rest of Chicago lay in a canyon. Quote, once Campbell's Soup was in this canyon, Sears was there, and Zenith, Sunbeam, the stockyards. There were jobs in industry where now there is a canyon of welfare and despair, end quote. The national economy under Clinton had rebounded, and a seemingly bottomless deficit had been filled. But inequality was deepening and widening. Quote, what is our obligation to the people in the canyon, end quote, Jackson demanded. Quote, that was Roosevelt's dream and Dr. King's, end quote. JR never set foot in the United Center during the convention. He spent his days setting up events in downtown hotel rooms where visiting delegates gathered. His hands were calloused from hanging posters, his thumbs bruised from tying balloons. He didn't hear a word Clinton or Jackson said, but JR reflexively dismissed the Reverend Jackson as a poverty pimp looking to advance his own career on the plight of the poor. And as for Clinton, JR knew that the president hadn't stood up for midnight basketball, the league he played in at Cabrini Green. Republicans attacked the puny line item in the president's $33 billion crime bill, ridiculing the idea that any tax dollars might be spent on what they deemed as games for criminals and crackheads. Clinton scrapped the program rather than defend it. It didn't matter that the league had been started under President George H.W. Bush, one of his, quote, 1,000 points of light, end quote, as a way to keep public housing residents engaged in positive activities, or that it was proven to reduce crime. JR was done with them all. He told Brother Jim about his decision to quit politics. Quote, I knew you figured that one out, end quote, Jim said. I think one of the things that's important to point out, and specifically in that portion that we just read, specifically in that portion that we just read, is the increasing in the police officers that President Bill Clinton brought into play, the increasing. That also increased a bunch more prisons were built and privatized, and there were a lot of different specific things that's in that bill that worsened a lot of the issues in inner city communities and black communities and brown communities. The 3 strikes you're out. Multiple of these things, when Hillary Clinton was running for office, Bill and Hillary would come out and say didn't have the effect that they thought it would have, and that they made mistakes. This is when they were using the super predator rhetoric. And again, it just shows how black people's lives of people of color, poor people, working class people's lives, the people who are the most vulnerable in our society, their lives swing on a pendulum to the politics of the time. And even as was pointed out in here, George H.W. Bush, a Republican, is the one who created the basketball league that was to be done in public housing, that had proven to lower crime and had proven to be effective, and was just a humane thing to do with some of this money. A Republican put that into play. But then when Bill Clinton took this swing, because that's what happened, is that the Democrats took this swing to being closer more similar to Republicans, became more moderate Democrats, and so he was trying to appease that crowd. He was trying to appease the being tough on crime crowd. And in an effort to put this police bill together to appease that crowd, he kept in something that another Republican before him had put into play. But because now he was a Democrat lobbying for it, though, that same party, the Republican Party, wanted it X'd out and wanted it gone. And he allowed for that. He didn't fight against that. And so there's multiple lessons to be learned in that about the dangers of a two-party system and the failures of electoral politics in our country. But I think the thing that stands out the most is that these parties are much more aligned in their thinking and in their belief than they are further or separated on it. And one of the things that remains on the bottom rung of their agenda are people of color, are poor people, are working class people, are people within the system of mass incarceration. And let's see. Okay. What JR focused on instead was perfecting his peddling business. He bought a red GMC Vandura, and later, when his profits allowed it, a blue one too. Most mornings he parked one of the vans outside a Cabrini Green high-rise, laid on the horn, and then began his rounds. Quote, "Tapes, CDs, movies," end quote, he cried. Quote, "Tapes, CDs, movies," end quote. JR shouldered a military duffel the size of a rowboat. Inside he placed cardboard runners to partition his wares, like in a case of wine. Old soul and hip-hop in separate compartments, pirated video games and others. From the strap, he dangled plastic bags filled with Bulls t-shirts and caps, with socks and towels. Michael Jordan had given up on baseball, thankfully, and the Bulls were again winning titles, God's gift to the city and to its street sellers. JR was a one-man Chicago Bulls emporium. His wasn't some jumpman's operation either, a strung-out barker pushing a stolen grocery cart. He was organized. He had systems. He called his daily rounds, quote, "rotating on the land," end quote. And his rotations covered much of Cabrini Green's 70 acres. JR would sell to the guys stationed in front of the building or in the lobby. They wanted the new Nas or Wu-Tang CD, a copy of Space Jam, or the Adam Sandler movie that had opened in theaters that weekend, and JR had the bootlegs at cut-rate prices. He teased them, saying that he earned more in a week than they did, and he was pushing product that at least was kind of legal. Then he climbed the high-rises, going floor to floor. He knew most people at Cabrini Green, at least by nickname, and there were regular customers whose apartments he always hit. Other residents, hearing his shouts, beckoned him to their doors. He knew when the checks for welfare, Social Security, and the city payroll arrived, and he might leave a high-rise with $300 in sales. He'd restock in his Vandura and then move on to the next building and then the next one. He went through the whites, the reds, the row houses. He set up shop as well on the floor of JJ Fish and Chicken, a fast food restaurant on Larrabee, spreading out a mat and covering it with merchandise. The owners accepted the arrangement as part of doing business in the neighborhood. It added up to a considerable haul. JR wasn't exactly the type to report to the IRS, but one year, when he was caught up in a criminal case, his lawyer persuaded him to file a tax return. He listed self-employment earnings of $87,900. He bought new Compaq and Hewlett-Packard computers, investing in software and drives to make his work copying music and movies easier. He rented his sister Marzetta a place on the south side so he could turn her Cabrini unit in 1017 North Larrabee into a warehouse and workshop. It wasn't just the money that drove him, though of course he chased that. There was the sport of it, the competition, the compulsion to win. There was another hustler, known as Big Boy for his considerable girth, a family friend who given JR his start duplicating movies. JR took over Big Boy's buildings at Cabrini, undercutting his prices. Willie Sr. had come back from Alabama to intervene, scolding JR for his lack of restraint. Quote, "Big Boy gotta eat too, son," end quote. And still it wasn't enough. On weekends, JR rented tables at the Swaporama, the giant flea market that operated on a barren rail yard blocks from the old stockyards. He scoured the market for goods he might resell back at Cabrini Green, picking up sports jerseys and car sound systems. All those women that did hair out of their apartments, JR would buy a case of 24 $1 tubes of gel for $6, offering it for $16 to the lady in 1230 North Burling who specialized in finger waves. For a while, he made a killing at Cabrini, reselling bed linens and comforters. Whenever a policeman accused JR of piracy, he would rattle off the laws he'd memorized. Quote, "These goods are protected under the U.S. copyright law, section 117-A-2, which states that it is not an infringement for the owner of a digital file to make another copy if said new copy is used as a backup," end quote. Usually the cop would move on to the next knucklehead who didn't have a defense lined up. On his rounds, JR would even drop into the station house in 365 West Oak high-rise, and officers on their shift would pick out toys for their children, horror movies, or porn. Once, when JR started selling little plug-in scooters, miniature bikes whose speeds topped out just under the legal limit requiring a license and registration, a police sergeant said he was going to arrest him for aiding and abetting drug dealers at Cabrini Green. He accused JR of giving criminals the means to zip away from the police. It was exactly the sort of slow-pitched softball comment that JR couldn't help but swing at. Quote, "Do you even read a book?" End quote. He shot out the cop loud enough for the crowds that invariably gathered. He was roused by a sense of indignation as well as by a need to perform. Quote, "Do you have any idea what you're talking about?" End quote. "What about Sammy's Red Hots on Division Street? Sammy sold hot dogs to dope dealers, right? And did the officer know that Mr. Yarrows down the block also provided criminals with the sustenance to carry out their illicit activities? Guys in the hood were notorious for shopping at City Sports. Weren't gangbangers using Nikes to run away from the authorities?" Quote, "I'm too smart for you," end quote, he told the police officer, mouthing the words with exaggerated slowness. Quote, "This one on the plantation learned to read," end quote. JR and Donna, the mother of his 4 children, have been on and off for 7 years, and they've been off for months in 1997 when she felt moved. Oh, the wind blowing, sorry. When she felt moved to reconcile after rewatching the Whitney Houston and Angela Bassett movie, Waiting to Exhale. She looked for JR and found him in his apartment with someone else. They argued, Donna picking up a fork from the kitchen counter and ramming it into his chest. They were done as a couple, but after a week, he and Donna turned cordial, trying to coordinate as much as they could to raise their children. That's when he was introduced to Aisha. 18, tall and graceful, she had a job in one of the Arab-owned groceries along the mall on Larrabee. JR liked that she was work-oriented, like himself, and that she'd been an athlete, also like himself. When they first started dating, the Master P movie, I'm 'Bout It, had just released. In no time, JR sold out of his first 50 pirated copies. By that evening, 100 other people had asked him for the tape. Quote, "When something goes viral on the land and a project thick with people, you could be a millionaire off it," end quote, JR roared. He bought 10 more VCRs to speed up production. Aisha not only didn't mind holding up in his apartment as he made the VHS copies, but was eager to help. That was a woman for him. Their relationship would end bitterly 10 years later as Aisha, finally, tearfully, came out as a lesbian. In the 90s, at Cabrini Green, it was hard to admit you were gay to others, let alone to yourself. But JR and Aisha lived happily enough for the time being. Quote, "We were the stars of the projects, a hustler and a worker," end quote, he would say of their union. Quote, "That was my heart," end quote. He bought a new Oldsmobile, midnight blue with gold flake paint, and they would drive to Wisconsin or Michigan for the weekend. Once for Aisha's birthday, he chartered a boat. They were served a candlelit dinner on Lake Michigan as they sailed to Michigan City, Indiana, where Aisha dropped another $800 at the premium outlet stores. Quote, "I love flashing money and helping people out," end quote, JR would say. He got himself colorful Coogee sweaters and throwback basketball jerseys. He burned through thousands of dollars betting on horses at the nearby off-track parlor, getting fat on the cheese fries. When Aisha gave birth to their first of 4 children together, they moved into a 5th-floor unit in one of the red high-rises at Cabrini. And there they enjoyed a version of a traditional family life. JR's children will wake in the morning, clambering atop him with big smiles. They sit down for breakfast, drinking orange juice together. He'd walk them to school, only a couple of blocks away, and then JR would head off to work, rotating on the dwindling land. That brings us to a changing of the themes within the chapter. I think this is the first time that anybody has come out within the pages that we've read, and this is the first time any mentioning of members of the LGBTQIA plus community has come up in the reading of High Rises. I don't think it was another time that it came up. But I think one of the things that is important when these new concepts are presented about what life is like in Cabrini Green, what life is like, and that being used as a microcosm for public housing in Chicago and the countrywide, is to then add that to the equation. So on top of the violence that exists, on top of the death that exists, on top of the substandard living conditions, the exploitation, the discrimination that exists, there's people in here who are dealing with not being able to be honest about their sexual preferences or their sexual orientation or how they identify because of the type of environment that they live in and the type of environment that exists, because of the culture of the environment and the culture that exists and the dangers that puts you in, you know, and just in the society that we exist in general. Being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community puts you in a position of vulnerability. It puts you in at a higher percentage to have certain acts of violence imposed upon you. And so then you have to add that into what it's already like for life and for people inside of Cabrini Green. And so we've seen how that's played out for women, how women had a distinct experience inside Cabrini Green, where we had, whether it be women having children and then having to DCFS come in and trying to take their children from them, whether that be women being raped and the vulnerability of being a woman and being raped inside of Cabrini Green, children dying, a mother and having her child die, mothers dealing with addiction, and so we see now too another one of the examples, or we see an example of what it's like for a member of the LGBTQIA plus community to be dealing with the things that go on in Cabrini Green. And I think one of the other things that stands out too is that as we read about JR, we see that he was sort of turned off by the same thing that he enjoyed about politics in one instance, that he could recommend something get done and it got done. He's seen the backside of it when President Clinton was being hypocritical, being hypocritical, yes, I'm not sure that's one of the things that they sort of pointed out, but eventually he's seen the bitter side of politics, and that led to him exiting. Here, let's try to We might end up going a little bit over the 30-minute mark, but I think that's fine. We try to get this chapter done with, I think we only got like 2 pages left. Hold on 1 second. Okay, yeah, let's try to knock this out. Annie Ricks. When Annie Ricks first moved into 660 West Division, a woman who lived on the 3rd floor of the high-rise stopped her. Quote, "You're going to be my neighbor," end quote, she said. Quote, "Yes, ma'am," end quote, Ricks replied. It turned out they were related. Over the years, when the elevators weren't working and Annie had to walk up the 5 flights to her apartment, she often popped in at this cousin's place on the 3rd floor and sat for a while at the kitchen table to talk. Then she'd walk up 1 flight and stop again on the 4th floor, where another set of relatives lived. Annie thought about leaving Cabrini Green after a shooting in the building, but it was the 3rd floor cousin who soothed her. Quote, "Baby, stay," end quote, she said. Quote, "It's going to get better," end quote. And it always did. Her son Deontay was named the 8th grade valedictorian of Schiller, where the students would still see Jesse White from time to time. Quote, "It's Mr. White to you, and Jesse to your mama," end quote, he say when they shouted his name. Annie's other children won basketball titles and all tournament honors, and their trophies lined their living room. Her older children found jobs working in construction, retail, and a private residential complex built atop the old Madison Street Skid Row, an area that had been renamed the West Loop. In one of the classrooms in which Annie worked, the teacher surprised her with a pair of earrings as a thank you. Her rent fluctuated from as much as $300 a month when the adults on the lease were all working to less than $50 a month when they weren't. One Christmas, her son Reggie had his name pulled out of a bag, and he was, quote, adopted, end quote, by the Slick Boys, the rapping cops bringing him gifts for the holidays. When he got older, Reggie would say that Cabrini Green was never as bad as people said. Quote, "They maintained that it was the most notorious project, but the 2 big things that people say about it are Dantrell Davis and Girl X. You feel me? They hold on to that," end quote. Reggie had gone to school with Girl X, as she was called to protect her identity. In 1997, the 9-year-old was attacked on the 6th floor landing of her Cabrini high-rise, just feet from the apartment in which her grandmother had lived for 40 years. She was raped and then choked with a T-shirt, the assailant spraying roach repellent in her mouth and leaving her for dead in a pile of dirty snow. She survived, though she was left blinded, mute, and partially paralyzed. Again, another unimaginable crime at Cabrini Green dominated headlines, and for outsiders, at least, the tenant lawsuit that was holding up development came to seem obscene. Quote, "What lifestyle is it that residents want to protect there anyway?" End quote, a columnist from the Tribune asked. The city had already invested tens of millions of dollars in public funds into the surrounding blocks of upgraded sewers and utilities for the widening and repaving of roads. Outside the Ricks' home, along Division, a 145,000 square foot shopping center was under construction. Work had also gotten underway on a new library and new police headquarters. Seward Park, the Oscar Mayer factory, had closed for good in 1992 after a century in the neighborhood. But in 1997, Old Town Square opened on the site with 113 new condos and single-family homes. Dan McLean, the well-connected developer of Central Station, Mayor Daley's new home, secured the desirable land and lucrative tax breaks in exchange for setting aside a dozen of the units for CHA families. Eager to settle this lawsuit with residents, city officials tried to assure Cabrini families that the rebuilding in the neighborhood was in their best interest. Weeks after the Girl X assault, the mayor's office held a community meeting at one of the local schools. A special assistant to Daley showed the crowd, quote, before, end quote, and, quote, after, end quote, slides of the plans for the area. Quote, "Not a pretty picture. Not much to look at," end quote, he said of the, quote, before, end quote, which for everyone else was both past and present. The, quote, after, end quote, he promised, would be a complete community, end quote. A Cabrini resident cut him off, quote, "A complete community for who?" End quote. They already had a community, people shouted. At another meeting, after the same official invited residents to take part in the planning process, a woman told him that her 49 years on the near north side had taught her one thing, quote, It's always the same. The forums start, then it breaks down, end quote, she said. Quote, they'll go behind your back, end quote. A Daley official at one of these public meetings chastised the crowd for interrupting her before she could deliver prepared remarks. A Cabrini tenant shot back, quote, you interrupted a way of life, lady, end quote. The Coalition to Protect Public Housing was formed in 1996 by Carol Steele, a Cabrini resident, and Wardale Yodegan from Rockwell Gardens on the west side. The group hoped to safeguard residents from these dubious development plans, taking as its motto, quote, redevelop, don't displace, end quote. The state of public housing might have been deplorable, but the coalition argued that the solutions so far didn't look much better. Quote, it wasn't about tearing down the bricks and mortar, it was about moving out the people, end quote, Steele said. She hosted Saturday workshops and town halls at Cabrini, telling residents about studies that tracked Section 8 families in Chicago and found they were ending up in all-black neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Many landlords refused to rent to large families with children altogether, and a third of the people given Section 8s were unable to find suitable housing before the vouchers expired. The Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, the Community Renewal Society, and other civic-minded nonprofits joined the coalition in its fight to preserve affordable housing in the city. A pamphlet the group distributed asked, quote, if not here, end quote. Above, a photo of a boy standing outside a 7-story red Cabrini high-rise, followed by the question, where? The group's largest action, quote, a people's march to protest public housing policies, end quote, took place on June 19, 1997. Juneteenth, the holiday celebrating the day in 1865 when slaves in Texas and other southern states learned belatedly about their freedom. Some 2,000 people gathered outside City Hall and the CHA's downtown offices. Many of them had come to Grant Park just 2 days earlier for the rally celebrating the Bulls' 5th title in 7 years. Quote, this championship goes to all the working people here in the city of Chicago who go out every single day and bust their butts to make a living, end quote. Michael Jordan had announced from the stage, for the public housing call to action, there were speeches, performances, and booths to register voters. Those gathered sang an old spiritual that had been used throughout the civil rights era and which took on special meaning when uttered by people fighting to stay in their housing of last resort. Quote, like a tree that's standing by the water, we shall not be moved, end quote. They needed to stand together and demand a more inclusive city. Quote, if you don't plan your community's future, end quote, a coalition handout warned, quote, someone else will, end quote. Annie Ricks knew about the meetings and marches. She heard her neighbors talk about the city's schemes to shut down Cabrini Green. She didn't really believe it, though. She pointed to 1230 North Burling, the high-rise across the field from here. The building had new doors and security cameras and 2 elevators that worked. After school most days, Annie brought her students over to play at the building's brand-new playground. Quote, why would you tear down a building when you just put money into it, end quote, she said. After the Girl X incident, Rick saw that there were more news crews and police officers in the area, but that also felt like to her more of the same. On her way across the parking lot to Schiller School, she was stopped by a cop. He demanded to know where she was going. Quote, work, end quote, she said. Quote, where are you going, end quote. One day she told Ernest Bryant that she was ready to get married. Although he had never been on her lease, they had 13 children and had been together for a quarter century. Quote, either you marry me or get out, end quote, she said in her half-joking way. Quote, all right, Jeffrey, end quote, he agreed. Quote, I'm going to marry you, end quote. He called his mother, who said Annie was already her daughter-in-law. They had a big wedding at a banquet hall on the south side, holding the service and reception at the same place so people would have less trouble getting there. Annie's aunt officiated, and her children got drunk. Quote, we had a good time, end quote, Rick said. And that brings us to the end of chapter 13. And I want to, again, encourage people to share this on whatever platform that you are listening to it on. And we put these episodes out on a daily basis to present people with the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism. mass incarceration and racial injustice. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.